Emily Carter stood at the entrance, her hesitation palpable. The clinic loomed before her, its sterile exterior offering no comfort. The faint hum of distant traffic did little to calm her unease as she stepped through the door, her pulse quickening with each step. The clinic had become the subject of whispered conversations, an enigmatic doctor curing illnesses thought untreatable. The stories of hope were often overshadowed by darker rumors of patients vanishing and unexplained complications. The duality of its reputation lingered in every corner, a blend of dread and reluctant optimism. The waiting room radiated tension. The clean, precise lines of the furniture seemed too perfect, almost unnatural. The plaque on the wall caught her eye. "For every cure, a cost." The words lingered in her mind, unsettling and cryptic. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by shallow breaths and the rustle of clothing. A piercing scream ripped through the stillness, sharp and unrelenting. Faces turned toward the source, wide-eyed and frozen. The sound echoed in the sterile air, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. The weight of the scream settled over the room, thick and suffocating, like a warning unspoken. The door swung open and a man stumbled forward, his movements unsteady and frantic. His skin was pale, his breathing labored. With wild eyes, he looked around the room before fixing his gaze on Emily. He staggered toward her, his voice low and broken. "Don't trust him," he managed, each word an effort. The warning hung in the air, heavy with fear and urgency. The man's body gave out, collapsing to the floor with a final, labored gasp. The room erupted in murmurs and gasps, but Emily remained rooted in place, her mind racing. The weight of his words bore down on her, as the lifeless figure before her served as a chilling testament to the danger she had stepped into. Adrian Cross was the kind of man who drew both admiration and unease in equal measure. At just 35, his groundbreaking medical techniques had saved lives deemed unsalvageable. Doctors hailed him as a visionary. Patients saw him as their last hope. His name was synonymous with miracles. And yet, miracles began to, but that changed overnight. A sudden scandal swept through the medical community. Whispers of malpractice and unapproved experimentation tarnished his once spotless reputation. He vanished from the public eye, retreating into obscurity. For years, no one spoke of him, until his name reappeared, linked to a small, discreet clinic promising impossible cures. He and his clinic started banishing people to form unexpected miracles, and celebrated his. Behind his calm demeanor and gentle tone lay a man whose ambitions bordered on obsession. For Dr. Cross, success wasn't measured by morality, but by results. End quote. Emily Carter clenched the photograph of her brother Jacob, her thumb brushing over his smiling face. It had been a year since his unexplained death, but the ache in her chest remained raw. The coroner's report cited heart failure, yet Jacob had been healthy, athletic even. Something about it felt wrong, hollow, failing. Then she found the receipt. A crumpled piece of paper tucked in the back of Jacob's desk drawer. A record of payment to Dr. Adrian Cross's clinic. Emily's grief twisted into something sharper, more determined. She spent her nights poring over articles, court filings, anything tied to Cross. The deeper she dug, the darker the picture became. Patients who left his clinic were either profoundly changed or never heard from again. Her resolve was unshakable, but so was her guilt. Had she noticed Jacob's struggles earlier, perhaps he'd still be alive. Now, driven by sorrow and unanswered questions, she saw uncovering the truth as the only way to make amends. Detective Mark Harris stared at the missing persons file spread across his desk, the same one that had haunted him for years. Names and faces stared back at him. People who had walked into Dr. Cross's clinic and never returned. One by one, he'd tried to build a case against the enigmatic doctor, but every lead fell apart. Cross was careful, almost surgical in how he avoided leaving evidence. Harris's frustration simmered beneath the surface, compounded by the pressure from his superiors to drop the matter. When Emily Carter barged into his office with her suspicions, he was skeptical. Her voice trembled with desperation as she explained her brother's connection to Cross, her insistence bordering on obsession. Listen, Harris said, leaning back in his chair. I've been after this guy for years, but without proof, solid proof, we're both wasting our time. Then help me find it, Emily countered, her eyes ablaze with determination. If we don't, no one will. Her persistence chipped away at his reluctance. Against his better judgment, he agreed to help, knowing this case could either vindicate him or destroy his career. Grace Cross stared at the divorce papers she'd never filed. The name Adrian Cross at the top mocked her, a reminder of the life she'd left behind but could never fully escape. Adrian hadn't always been this way. When they first met, he was charming, passionate about his work, and deeply devoted to her. But his ambition became something darker, more consuming. She'd uncovered his experiments by accident, journals filled with horrifying details, results documented with clinical detachment. The day she confronted him, his mask slipped. His voice was calm, but the look in his eyes chilled her. "You don't understand," he said. "This is for the greater good. Sacrifices have to be made. Spirit Watcher, sacrifices have to be made." She left that night, but guilt followed her. She'd remained silent, too afraid to expose him, knowing the backlash would ruin her too. Now, Emily's persistence had dragged her back into the shadows she'd tried to leave behind. The clinic opened quietly, almost unnoticeable at first. Word spread through whispers, testimonials from patients who swore they'd been cured of terminal illnesses. For families desperate to save loved ones, Dr. Cross's clinic became a beacon of hope. But for every story of miraculous recovery, there were murmurs of something sinister. Patients would vanish without explanation, their families left with more questions than answers. Others would emerge from the clinic cured, but profoundly altered, distant, unrecognizable. Reports of malpractice began to surface, though none ever stuck. Cross's carefully cultivated image shielded him, and his patients' fear of retaliation silenced them. Yet, as the whispers grew louder, the clinic's reputation shifted from miraculous to malevolent. The clinic itself seemed designed to unsettle. Strange, angular symbols were carved into the walls, their meanings obscure but disturbing. Staff members avoided eye contact, their movements mechanical and rehearsed. The suspect manager marched in front of the clinic, his face casting a barrier around it. Former patients occasionally spoke out, their stories fragmented and cryptic. One man described a procedure he couldn't recall but was haunted by nightmares of blinding lights and incomprehensible pain. A woman, her eyes hollow, warned, "He takes something from you, something you can't get back." Locals began to avoid the building altogether, crossing the street to avoid its shadow. To those who passed by, it was more than a clinic. It was a place of unspoken horrors, waiting to be uncovered. Emily Carter sat across from a former patient of Dr. Cross, her recorder perched on the table. The man's hands trembled as he described his experience, his voice barely above a whisper. "I went in for my lungs," he murmured, his gaze fixed on the cup of untouched coffee before him. "They told me I'd be dead in 6 months. But Cross, he said he could fix me. And he did. I can breathe better now, but his voice faltered. But what? Emily pressed, leaning forward. He glanced up, his eyes hollow. I don't feel like myself anymore. It's like something's missing. I wake up every night with these nightmares, lights, pain, sounds I can't describe. And the weakness, it never goes away. Some days I can barely lift my arms. Emily's stomach churned. He wasn't the first to recount such horrors. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. Procedures that fixed one thing but destroyed something deeper, intangible. Determined to find answers, Emily scoured archives and medical records, her nights consumed by research. A name kept appearing: Adrian Cross, Adrian's mother. The articles she uncovered painted a grim picture. A woman who had died of a rare degenerative disease when Adrian was only 14. The records hinted at the desperation of a boy who watched his mother waste away, powerless to help. Her breakthrough came in the form of a journal, tucked away in the dusty stacks of a university library. The entries were chilling. Scribbled in a teenager's hand, they detailed crude experiments conducted on stray animals, each one aimed at understanding how to preserve life. One line stood out, scrawled in frantic handwriting. Vital essence. What keeps us alive? What makes us human? If I can find it, I can stop death. Emily closed the journal, her fingers trembling. This wasn't just a man with ambition. This was someone haunted by grief, his obsession rooted in a desperate need to defy the inevitable. The email arrived late at night. Its subject line read, "Answers you seek." The sender claimed to have insider knowledge of Cross's experiments. Emily hesitated, then clicked. The email contained vague promises of proof and a location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. She felt a flicker of hope, but also unease. The next day, as she stood outside the decrepit building, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Be careful. He knows." Her breath hitched, but she pressed on. Inside, she found a folder containing patient files, each one stamped with the clinic's logo. But as she sifted through the documents, her chest tightened. The names were familiar, patients she'd already interviewed. There was nothing new here. A low chuckle echoed behind her. "Looking for something?" Dr. Cross's voice was calm, almost amused. He stepped into the light, his eyes locked on hers. "No. You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, his tone soft but menacing. "Digging up old ghosts, chasing shadows. But tell me, Emily, have you considered what your brother might have kept from you? Secrets he didn't want you to uncover." Her heart raced. His words planted seeds of doubt, twisting her resolve. The footsteps started a week later. They followed her home from work, always just far enough to remain unseen. Her apartment, once a sanctuary, felt violated when she returned one evening to find her notes scattered and her laptop smashed. The police offered little help, dismissing it as a random burglary. Emily's mind spiraled. She barely slept, her dreams filled with flashes of her brother's face and Cross's mocking smile. She began to question every shadow, every passerby. One night, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a single photo. Her standing outside the clinic. The message read, "Stop now, or you'll end up like him." Emily confronted Grace in a dimly lit cafe, the air between them thick with tension. "Why are you here?" Grace asked, her voice wary. "I know about your son," Emily said, her tone sharp. "I know what he did." Grace flinched, her hands clutching her cup. "You don't know anything." "Then tell me," Emily demanded. "Because people are dying, and I can't stop him without your help." Grace's resolve crumbled. Tears slid down her cheeks as she spoke. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Adrian, he wanted to save lives. But our son, his experiments went wrong. He pushed too far and... Her voice broke. I couldn't stop him. I was too afraid. Emily reached across the table, her voice softening. You can't change the past, but you can help me stop him now. Grace nodded, her fear battling against a newfound determination. Detective Harris's brow furrowed as he flipped through Emily's notes. This is thin, he said, his skepticism clear. It's all I have, Emily shot back. He sighed. You're chasing a ghost. Cross has been untouchable for years. What makes you think you'll succeed where I haven't? Because I have something you didn't, Emily replied, her voice steady. A reason. Harris studied her, his doubt evident but waning. Fine, he said finally. But if this falls apart, you're on your own. Emily's pursuit of the truth pushed her closer to the edge. Her relationship strained under the weight of secrecy. Even Grace, her ally, grew distant, consumed by guilt. One night, Emily stared at her reflection, her eyes hollow. What if he's right? She whispered to herself. What if I'm no better than him? End of chapter 2. End of section 3. Her doubts threatened to consume her, but the faces of the victims, those still suffering and those gone, drove her forward. The cost of betrayal weighed heavily, but she knew the stakes. If she failed, Cross would continue, unchecked and unstoppable. Encouragement and blame and consummation were lacking. Her hopes were low. At least the victims couldn't see. The stage was set. The truth lay just beyond her reach, but she'd have to risk everything to uncover it. Emily Carter walked into the clinic with deliberate steps, her heart pounding as she clutched her bag, the hidden recorder snugly tucked inside. The air was sterile, heavy with the scent of disinfectant, but beneath it, a sinister undertone seemed to linger. Dr. Adrian Cross sat at his desk, his expression unreadable. He gestured for her to sit, his voice calm but laced with authority. Miss Carter, I trust you've found my work intriguing. Emily met his gaze, her hands steady as she placed them on the desk. Intriguing isn't the word I'd use, Dr. Cross. Exploitative, destructive, those come to mind. His eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile didn't falter. You came here for answers. I assume you've found them. Sefan asked, What? I've found enough to know you're not a healer. You're a predator. Her voice was steady, but inside, every nerve screamed at her to run. Anis closed the laptop and placed it in her lap. Cross leaned back, his fingers steepled. And yet, you're still here. Let's not pretend you don't want the whole story. Predator, he repeated, as though tasting the word. Do you even understand what that means? Or are you just using it for shock value? Emily's jaw tightened. I understand perfectly. You've preyed on people desperate for hope. People like my brother. Ah, yes, Cross interrupted, his tone soft yet cutting. Jacob. The good athlete, the charming brother, the one who couldn't bear to tell his family how sick he truly was. The words hit her like a punch. Her composure wavered for a fraction of a second before she steadied herself. You manipulated him, just like you've done to countless others. Cross stood, his towering figure casting a shadow over her. Do you think this is easy, Ms. Carter? Saving lives? Every breakthrough comes with sacrifice. What I do is no different from any pioneer who dares to push boundaries. People like you, he sneered, are too narrow-minded to see the bigger picture. Emily felt her anger rise, but before she could retort, he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. You want justice for your brother? Fine. But tell me, how many lives are you willing to ruin to get it? As he turned his back to her, Emily's eyes darted around the office. Her gaze landed on a door partially concealed behind a cabinet. Without hesitation, she stood and moved toward it. What are you doing? Cross demanded, his voice sharp. Ignoring him, she pushed the door open. Her breath caught in her throat as the scene unfolded before her. Shelves lined with jars containing preserved organs, their grotesque shapes illuminated by cold fluorescent light. A wall adorned with photographs of patients labeled "successful outcomes," especially the dim-sounding jars. Jars full of missing horned limbs, and jars full of missing faces. Successful outcomes. In the center of the room sat a journal, its pages open to detailed notes and sketches. Emily's trembling hands turned the pages, each one more horrific than the last. Cross's experiments weren't just invasive, they were monstrous. What is this? She whispered, her voice trembling with equal parts fury and fear. This, Cross said from behind her, his tone colder than ever, is the price of progress. Before Emily could react, Cross grabbed her wrist, forcing her to drop the journal. His grip was unrelenting, his previously calm demeanor now a mask of rage. You've gone too far, he hissed, dragging her away from the desk. Do you really think anyone will believe your story? I'll make sure they see you as a desperate journalist, willing to fabricate lies. Emily struggled against his hold, her mind racing. You can't silence the truth, she spat, her voice defiant, despite the terror coursing through her veins. Oh, but I can, he growled, his face inches from hers. And I will. Adrian, the voice was firm yet tinged with pain. Both Emily and Cross turned to see Grace standing in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. Grace, Cross said, his grip on Emily loosening. You shouldn't be here. I can't keep watching you destroy everything, she replied, her voice steady despite the tears welling in her eyes. You've gone too far. Emily seized the opportunity and wrenched herself free, stumbling toward Grace. The older woman pulled out her phone, dialing with trembling hands. I'm calling the authorities, Adrian. It's over. Cross's eyes darkened, his fury replaced by something far more dangerous. Desperation. In his panic, Cross lunged for a console on the far wall. Emily recognized it immediately from his journal, a device meant to harness what he called vital essence. Don't! Grace shouted, but Cross ignored her, frantically adjusting dials and pressing buttons. The machine roared to life, its hum growing into an ear-splitting whine. Sparks flew as the device malfunctioned, sending a surge of electricity through the room. Cross screamed, his body convulsing before collapsing to the floor. The machine sputtered and died, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Emily and Grace stood frozen, their breaths ragged as they stared at the lifeless form of the man who had caused so much pain. He was his own undoing, Grace whispered, her voice hollow. Emily's legs felt weak, but she steadied herself, pulling out her recorder. Let's make sure the world knows what he's done. The once bustling clinic stood silent, its blinds drawn and its doors chained shut. Police officers moved in and out, their faces grim as they carried boxes of evidence to waiting vans. The media swarmed outside the perimeter, cameras clicking as reporters shouted questions no one would answer. Inside, the scene was far more chilling. Shelves packed with patient files detailed procedures too horrific to recount. Jars containing preserved organs and biological samples painted a grotesque picture of Dr. Cross's experiments. The discovery of hidden rooms and disturbing medical journals left seasoned officers visibly shaken. The news broke within hours, sparking national outrage. Headlines screamed accusations, "Doctor of Death," "Cures that Kill," and "Science Gone Too Far." On every screen, experts debated how a man could operate unchecked for so long. It was the effects of war that irritated them the most, the sadness of it all. The public demanded accountability, asking the same haunting question: how many lives had been lost because no one dared to stop him? Emily Carter stared at her laptop screen, her article already trending. The exposé was raw, detailed, and unflinching, laying bare the horrors of Cross's clinic. It detailed not only his crimes, but the stories of his victims, people whose lives were shattered in the name of medical progress. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from colleagues and offers for interviews, but none of it brought her any joy. She sat in the quiet of her apartment, the weight of her own words pressing down on her. Her mind drifted to Jacob, her brother, whose death had set her on this path. She couldn't shake the thought that if she'd uncovered the truth sooner, perhaps he, and so many others, might have been saved. When her editor called to celebrate the article's success, she cut the conversation short. "It's not a victory," she whispered, staring at Jakob's photo on her desk. "It's just too late." Mark Harris leaned against his desk, the glow of his computer screen highlighting the furrowed lines on his face. His precinct was buzzing with activity, but the noise barely registered. On his desk lay the files, cases he'd been unable to solve, names he couldn't forget. He flipped through one of the folders, his jaw tightening as he saw a familiar face. A missing patient from Cross's clinic. For years he had suspected the doctor, but the lack of evidence and bureaucratic roadblocks had kept him from acting. "Maybe if I'd pushed harder," he muttered, his voice heavy with regret. A younger officer approached, offering a weak smile. "Sir, you were up against the impossible. No one could have connected the dots like Emily did." Harris nodded but didn't reply. He'd failed to stop Cross, and that failure would haunt him. Still, as he closed the file, he made a silent promise. The next time, he wouldn't hesitate. Grace Cross sat alone in a courtroom, the harsh fluorescent lights casting shadows across her face. Her testimony had been the linchpin in dismantling Adrian's legacy. She had recounted every detail of his crimes, his experiments, his lies, and the lengths he went to hide the truth. Her immunity from prosecution came with a heavy price. In the public's eyes, she was as complicit as he was. Whispers followed her everywhere. How could she not know? Why didn't she stop him? Her hand went to the buttons of her jerk. The memories of their life together haunted her. Adrian had been charming, brilliant, and ambitious, but over time that ambition had morphed into something monstrous. She'd turned a blind eye, hoping the man she loved would change. Now, as she stepped out of the courthouse, she felt the weight of her silence more than ever. She resolved to spend the rest of her life making amends, though she knew some wounds could never heal. The families of Dr. Cross's victims came forward in waves, each one telling a story more heartbreaking than the last. Lawsuits against the clinic piled up, each seeking justice for lives lost and irreparably damaged. Courtrooms were filled with tearful testimonies, photographs of smiling faces that would never return, and descriptions of suffering no one should endure. One father, clutching a framed photo of his daughter, looked directly at the judge. "We trusted him," he said, his voice trembling, "and he betrayed us all." The public outcry pushed lawmakers into action. Medical oversight committees were overhauled, and stricter regulations were introduced to prevent similar atrocities. Healthcare providers were held to higher standards, ensuring that no doctor could operate unchecked again. Dr. Cross's clinic became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when ambition goes unchecked. For the victims, the reforms couldn't undo the past, but they offered a glimmer of hope for a safer future. The room was silent except for the faint hum of Emily's laptop. The article she had poured her heart into was now live, reaching thousands, but the sense of achievement felt hollow. Her brother's smiling face stared back at her from a photo propped on her desk, his memory a constant reminder of what she had lost. Emily leaned back in her chair, her hands gripping the edges of the armrests. She had exposed the truth, pulled the curtain back on Dr. Cross's atrocities, but the price had been steep. Jacob was gone, and no amount of justice could bring him back. "I'm sorry, Jacob," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I should have seen it sooner." Her chest tightened as guilt gnawed at her. Cross's betrayal wasn't just of his patients. It was of the trust they'd placed in him. Emily had uncovered the truth, but the scars left by his actions ran deep, and they would never fully heal. Anticipating money troubles in Prudence Park, it was always important to plan for backup, especially in the evening. Grace Cross sat across from Emily in a quiet cafe, her hands trembling as she clutched a steaming cup of tea. Her testimony against Adrian had been the final nail in his coffin, but the victory felt more like a punishment. "I should have spoken out years ago," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe then, maybe—" She couldn't finish the thought. Emily watched her carefully, seeing the conflict in her eyes. "You did what you could," she offered gently. "You gave people the truth. That matters." Grace shook her head, tears welling up. "It doesn't erase what I allowed to happen. I was his wife, Emily. I saw the signs, I knew, and I stayed silent." "Courage isn't about what you should have done," Emily replied, her tone firm. "It's about what you choose to do now, and you chose to do the right thing." Next time she paused, and her gaze drifted over me. My nostrils tightened as, for the first time in months, Grace felt the faintest flicker of hope. Her decision to testify had shattered her world, but perhaps, in the wreckage, she could find some measure of redemption. Later that night, Emily sat alone, her thoughts drifting back to Adrian Cross. He had been both a monster and a man haunted by his own demons. His obsession with preserving life had driven him to unspeakable lengths, but was it pure evil or desperation? Her pen hovered over her notebook, the questions swirling in her mind. Was he blinded by arrogance, or was he trying to save others from the pain he endured as a boy? Emily sighed, setting the pen down. The truth was, she might never know. Cross's legacy was a grim one, a reminder of the dangerous line between ambition and morality. Science had given him power, but his inability to control it had made him a cautionary tale. The clinic stood empty, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Emily stood outside, the chill of the evening air biting at her skin. She stared at the building, the place that had promised miracles but delivered nightmares. "For every cure, a cost," she murmured, her breath visible in the cold. The words etched into the clinic's plaque were a haunting truth she couldn't ignore. Justice had come, but at a steep price. The lives lost, the families shattered, the trust destroyed. It was all a testament to how easily good intentions could spiral into destruction. As she turned to leave, Emily cast one final glance at the building. It was over, but the memories would remain. A constant reminder of the fine line between healing and harm, between justice and sacrifice.